In this episode of Akram's Ideas, I'm going to show you how I put together my Mabel Pines Halloween costume, so stay tuned. Hello and welcome. I'm Akram Burris, and you're watching Akram's Ideas, bringing creative and crazy ideas to life. In this Halloween special edition of Akram's Ideas, I'm going to go over some of the steps I went through to make my one-of-a-kind Mabel Pines costume. Now, if you're not familiar with Mabel Pines, she is a character on the Disney cartoon Gravity Falls, which is this hilarious show about Mabel and her brother Dipper who go to live with their Grunkle Stan. He owns a mystery shack, which is just kind of random nonsense tourist trap shop in Gravity Falls, Oregon. Well, as it turns out, there's actually mysterious things that occur in Gravity Falls, and Dipper and Mabel kind of solve the mystery. Mabel is just a crazy goofball character, and I have been told several times that I remind people of Mabel. So I thought, since the series ended just earlier this year, I thought that it would be just fitting for me to kind of bid it farewell by dressing up as Mabel Pines this year for Halloween. So what did I do to construct the Mabel Pines iconic shooting star, rainbow shooting star sweater, and then of course the purple skirt and everything? Well, if you watched my October sewing plans, I kind of alluded to what pattern I was going to be using to make this outfit. And I actually used New Look 6145 to make the sweater. And the reason for that is, in the cartoon, Mabel always wears these sort of really large, puffy sweaters that have sort of a cowl neck collar. And this particular pattern has that perfect cowl neck collar on it. So I thought that it would be a perfect pattern to use. And while it is a dress pattern, I actually cut it. I cut it about, I believe, 4 inches below the waist so that I could get a little more length on it. And I pretty much cut out all the pieces according to the pattern. And what I did first off is I traced all my pattern pieces that I was going to use for this project. And as always, I had to grade between some sizes to get my waist measurement correct, since I'm a size 16 on the bust, but then I kind of pan out to a size 18 to 20 depending on the pattern. So I have to do some sort of French curving to kind of get that into proportion. I actually chose to use this it's sort of a deep magenta. It comes across a little red on camera, but it's more of a magenta pink. And it's a jersey fabric that I already had in my stash. So I knew right away that that was the fabric that I was going to use for this project, since Mabel's always wearing either a pinkish, a dark pink, or a purple sweater in a lot of the series. So I went with this color. And I cut out my back and front pieces. Now, in the pattern instruction, it requires a zipper since it is a dress, but I decided not to include the zipper because I wanted this sweater to be kind of loose and baggy, kind of like what Mabel wears on the show. So I actually cut the back piece as is, but I cut it on the fold, so I didn't need any kind of zipper. I also eliminated the darts on the back of the pattern since I didn't want it to be too fitted, because again, Mabel's sweater is really loose and big on her. I did leave the shaping darts on the front of the sweater here, simply so that I could wear this sweater again and it'd be a little bit more flattering than just sort of a box sweater on me. And I sewed up the side seams of the sweater here at a 3/4 inch seam as opposed to the 5/8 inch seam, only again to make it a little bit looser and more baggier on me. And it's just a big comfy sweater in the end is what I'm going to end up using it for, but this gives me more of that big sweater that Mabel wears on the show. Now, I sewed the sleeves pretty much the same way. To ensure that they've stayed on my shoulder correctly, I went ahead and sewed the armhole seams to the sleeve at a 5/8 inch seam, and then I sewed the sleeve seam itself at a 3/4 inch seam so that it is a little big and loose in the arm as well. Now, this particular pattern had a 3/4 inch sleeve, and at first I thought that I was just going to extend the sleeve so it was really big. However, in several episodes of Gravity Falls, Mabel's got her sleeves rolled up really heavily into these big cuffs because her sweaters are kind of oversized. So I thought I would just use the 3/4 sleeve as is, and I made these cuffs additions to the sweater. To make the cuff for our sleeve, what I did is I took the sleeve pattern and I measured the width of the sleeve from one end to another so that I made sure that I got the correct width for the whole circumference of the sleeve. Then, based off of that, I cut out a rectangle to what I originally thought I wanted the cuff to be. But then after cutting out this piece, I realized that the cuff would end up being folded on itself, which made the cuff smaller. So in the end, what I ended up doing is actually cutting a piece that was double this. So I cut this on the fold basically so that it was twice as big as the pattern piece that I made. So my end cuff would be approximately 5 inches in height. And because, again, I wanted to give the illusion that these are really, really long sleeves that have been rolled up. And because they have been rolled up, we wanted to be really, really thick. So what I did is I turned around and cut some quilt batting about the same size of my rectangle for the cuff. And for this, to connect this to the sleeve, I calculated that I'm going to need 3/4 of an inch on the side seams, because that's what I sewed the sleeve side seams at. But I'm going to attach the top portion of the cuff at 3/4 inch seam, but the bottom portion that's going to fold over and hide our raw edges, I'm going to sew that at a 5/8 inch seam. So I'm going to baste my quilt batting on here, 3/4 inch seam all the way around, except the very bottom edge is going to be 5/8 inch of a seam. So let's do that. Now you can see that I simply basted on my quilt batting onto my cuff piece, and then it's not a big deal. Basically, I'm going to actually come into this seam allowance and cut back to the edge of that basting stitch, because I don't want my quilt batting to be a part of the seam. I don't want a bulkier seam. This jersey fabric's already pretty bulky, and so I don't want necessarily a really bulky seam, but I do want the cuffs to give the illusion of being really bulky and that it's made up of many layers of folding a really, really, really oversized shirt. At this point, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and sew the side seams together here, like so. And I'm going to sew that at a 3/4 inch seam, because that's what I'm using for the majority of this shirt. And I'm also going to be using a stretch seam, because this is a jersey material, so that it'll give it a little extra stretch. Once I sewed my seam up, I ironed it flat open, and then the bottom or the inside fold of the cuff, I went ahead and ironed and I went ahead and pressed at that 5/8 inch base stitch so that it's folded back over on itself at 5/8 inch seam. And this will all become clearer as once we get it sewn up, but this is going to be the overlap that's going to get some top stitching to hold it into place. Now to put this all together, as you can see, I have my shirt inside out, and it may be a little confusing at first, but you'll see when I get it all together here. But basically what I'm doing is I'm taking the inside of the shirt, so this is the wrong side of the fabric, and I'm going to take the right side of my cuff, and I'm going to put it over it. And basically I'm going to match up my seams here, just like so. And I've already trimmed back the seam allowance on the sleeve itself, so I'm just going to turn it to one side, that bulk part, and I'm going to line up the seams, and I'm going to pin this all around the edge of the sleeve here. And then I'm going to take this to the sewing machine, and I'm going to sew this at the 3/4 inch seam allowance that I already have set up here. Here we have the sleeve, and I've turned it right side out again. And so here you can see is our cuff, which is still inside out, but the sleeve is right side out. And I've taken that seam that we sewed and I've ironed it up, because what we're going to do now is we're going to take this top part and basically we're going to roll it so that that 5/8 inch seam allowance, if I can get to it here, it's a little bit clunky to work with, but what you're going to do, you got to kind of straighten it out as you go, and you're going to pull it through here. You're going to roll it back on itself. So what's going to happen is you're going to take that 5/8 inch seam allowance that we have and just overlap it ever so slightly along the other seam. Now here's the really tricky part, because this is going to be, we don't want this to have the nice clean edge necessarily. We want the other side, because we're going to fold this whole cuff over a second time. So it's going to be, it's kind of a weird situation. But what you want is you want to get it so that you can see all the way around that this is exactly just a hair over your seam allowance here, so that it's going to grab when we top stitch on the inside of the fabric. So what we're going to do, I'm going to roll this whole thing over, and what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to pin on this side. Now, and it's really hard to see, but you can kind of feel with your hand along this seam here whether or not you've got the edge of your cuff. And you also want to make sure that cuff is still folded back on itself, so this raw edges aren't showing, so you can kind of feel it. And with that, you're going to pin along the whole interior here. So again, this is the inside of the shirt. I've rolled the cuff back on itself, and I'm just kind of pinning along this edge to make sure that the other end of the cuff is laying down just past this seam. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to top stitch along this edge here to grab the other side and hold it down. Here we have the sleeve. This is still the inside of the shirt, and I went ahead and I stitched along that inner edge. And basically the idea, if I turn it back right side out, you can see that our sleeve has caught here and it's laying down. Now it's not perfect, but it's not a big deal, because this is going to be hidden when we roll up our cuff here. And so basically I'm just going to come up with the cuff to this edge here, just like so. And there you have it. There is our sleeve cuff rolled up. And so now it's got this bulkiness to it, that it appears like the sleeve is much longer and that we've rolled it up heavily. Now for for the bottom of the sweater, I basically made a similar setup as to the cuff. I sort of made like a bottom cuff for it. Now, originally I wanted something really bulky and padded like the sleeves cuffs to make it look like a giant sweater that kind of rolled up on itself. But in all honesty, I just sort of ran out of time and I was getting frustrated and I'm like, I gotta get it done. So all I did was I measured from the side seams of both sides of the shirt and I cut out a 4-inch rectangle that length. I sewed it up at the side seams here so that I get a continuous band all the way around. And then just like I attached the cuff, I sewed a 3/4 inch seam to the bottom, to the top of the cuff band here. And then as I did with the cuff, I rolled it over and then folded over 5/8 inch at the bottom seam, and using a top stitching, I sort of stitched along the ditch here to grab the bottom half, creating this band. It's not as clean as I would have liked it, and it's not bulky like I like, but it sits pretty well and it works for what I want it to do. Like I said earlier, I chose this pattern because it already had a cowl neck collar, and in all honesty, I wish I'd chosen a pattern that had a much bigger cowl neck. That's kind of the type of sweater that Mabel wears, is a really bulky cowl neck. But I liked this cowl neck shape and I'm really happy with it as an overall sweater or overall look, even though it's not as big as I would have liked for the costume. I sewed it up exactly like the pattern instructions said. However, it also included a facing, and once I got the cowl neck on, it was really bulky in the seams, and I just felt like a facing would make it even bulkier. So I finished the inside seam using a zigzag stitch, and then I just understitched that seam down so that it would stay on the inside. Another iconic feature of Mabel's sweaters is that there's always some sort of graphic on there, and it's usually something very humorous and sometimes something that is related to the episode in some way or another. But they're always kind of weird, funny little things. Now, the star with the shooting rainbow here is her standard look. She wears this pretty often, and if you look up Mabel Pines, this is typically the sweater that she's wearing. Now, to make this, I just took some felt and I took a star cookie cutter that I had and used it as a template to make the star. And then from there, I just sort of free-handed the purple, green, and orange rose. Once I had all that, I took another piece of felt and hot glued them all down to that felt so that they would lay flat. And then finally I put them on the sweater, and I've sewed it all the way around, including each band of the rainbow there. And the reason for that, based on Mabel's illustration, the star rainbow kind of sets right at the bust line, and Mabel doesn't have any curves. So for me, since I do have curves, I didn't want any weird gaping when I moved around. When the star rainbow sat here at the bust line. So I made sure that it was stitched in all places so that it would move with the sweater and curve correctly. Now, Mabel usually wears a purple skirt that go along with her pink sweaters. And so I already had my dark purpley maroon Delphine skirt that I made back in September. And I decided to pair that with the sweater. It works really, really well. It has that A-line shape, which is similar to the skirts that Mabel wears. And then to finish it all up, I just paired a pair of white socks, my black Mary Janes, and then of course the iconic scarf that Mabel always wears in her hair. I hope you've enjoyed this Halloween special of Akram's Ideas, and if you did, be sure to give it a big thumbs up. And as always, don't forget to follow Akram's Ideas on social media or subscribe to our channel. Thanks for watching.